Good afternoon. I really appreciate y'all being here to hear about my growing up in the same house with somebody I consider my hero. I call this an abbreviated true story of a 20th century Argonaut. And before you wonder why, at my advanced age, I call my father Daddy in this essay, he always was and always will be Daddy to me. Three cheers for Captain Cone, our principal, Major Conley, called out from the stage. Hip, hip, hooray, hip, hip, hooray, hip, hip, hooray. Children's high-pitched voices filled the PS 98 auditorium. Winter sun filtered through the tall windows along each side of the room, lighting up row after row of students' eager faces. Teachers, the ladies from the school office, even some parents stood in the aisles and across the back. Cheering children waved tiny American flags, each blue field spangled with 48 stars. This February of 1943, I was 5 years old, and we cheered for my own father, Captain Howard M. Cone, Jr., 34 years old, master of ocean flying. He'd just returned from piloting President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to the Casablanca Conference on Pan American World Airways' flying boat, the Dixie Clipper. Not only was he the first to fly a sitting U.S. president, Daddy was also the first to fly a president outside the United States, the first to fly a president during wartime, and the Dixie Clipper was the first of the famous airplanes to become known as Air Force One. Even though kindergartners didn't attend school assemblies, I was invited to join the big kids for this special occasion because I was his daughter. That's how I got to wave my own tiny flag and cheer for my hero, the handsomest man in the whole world. Let's see if I can do this. What did I do? I wasn't lying, was I? Up on the stage, Daddy could have been the captain standing on the deck of a great sailing ship. The PAA insignia on his cap, the buttons, the wings on his chest sparkled gold against the dark blue of his Pan American uniform. If Hollywood had made a movie about this event, Gregory Peck surely would have been the star. My daddy wasn't like my friends' fathers. He didn't wear a suit and tie and take the Long Island Railroad to the city 5 days a week. He wore the uniform of movie stars and flew the world's most glamorous airplane. He'd be away from home as long as 10 days at a time, but then be home for a week or more when he could teach his kids how to sail, coach tennis to the local kids, raise bees on the garage roof, and build a boat in our basement. The president's flight we children celebrated that day was history making. Word of it was in all the newspapers and on the radio and in the newsreels at the movies. Many of my friends and their parents were in awe of him. Though Daddy was modest about his accomplishments, he certainly would have objected to being called an Argonaut. He insisted children call him Mr. Cone when they'd rather say Captain, and he wore his uniform only when on duty. My guess is he dressed in his captain's blues the day he spoke to my school at the request of our principal, a veteran of World War I. More than 8 decades after that day at PS 98, the thrill is still vivid. Including his Navy training, it took approximately 13 years for my father to reach that point in his career. He and his aviator buddies were already seen as pioneers during the golden age of the flying clippers. One described himself as an Argonaut, which, according to the Free Dictionary, is a person who is engaged in a dangerous but rewarding quest, an adventurer. Since the term suits Daddy, I'll borrow it and add that he often said he was one of the lucky few who loved his work. He was born in Crossett, Arkansas. His family moved to Louisiana, then to Washington State as his father followed the timber industry. He began preparing for his life in the air when he majored in aeronautical engineering at the University of Washington. He enrolled in a Navy-sponsored pre-flight course in a nearby city, and since it was during the Depression and he didn't have transportation, he commuted by hopping freight trains. After completing the pre-flight course, he took a leave of absence from the university in 1930 and 31 to follow his dream in the Naval Reserve at Pensacola, Florida, where he was among the first to land on an aircraft carrier. He then served a year of active duty in the Pacific Fleet with the VP-9 Patrol Squadron, flying twin-engine Martin patrol boats. Daddy returned to the university to finish his degree, and while there, he crewed on the rowing team. He graduated in 1933, just before his coach and teammates competed at and won the 1936 Berlin Olympics. After graduation, he went to New York, where the fledgling Pan American World Airways hired him and sent him to Miami. His apprentice pilot training began as crew on Sikorsky 40 flying boats in the Caribbean and Latin America. Pan American's success depended on the proficiency of its flight crews, assured by rigorous training. Before achieving the rank of captain, Daddy and his fellow pilots spent thousands of hours in seaplanes, gaining skills in long-distance over-water flight. They mastered dead reckoning, timed turns, judging drift from sea current, and astral and radio navigation. And if they happened to arrive at fogged-in harbors with poor to no visibility, they landed at sea and taxied into port. Over the next 4 years, Daddy worked his way up through the ranks, flying ever more sophisticated seaplanes, learning as he went. His goal, first, foremost, and always, was to sit in the cockpit's left seat, the captain's chair. Since Mother is also part of this story, she deserves an introduction too. Jenny Ray Nall was a pretty Georgia girl with dark braids wrapped in a coronet around her head. Her family moved to Miami when she was 12, during the boom times, almost literally. Their train from Elberton arrived in the midst of the 1926 hurricane, one of the worst ever to hit South Florida. She graduated from Florida State College for Women in 1935, majoring in economics, not home economics, and worked at a radio station in one of the downtown Miami's tallest buildings. She danced everything from the foxtrot to the Charleston and was dating a Pan American pilot when Daddy cut in one night and swept her off her feet to a life she never imagined. Their first date was on Labor Day, 1935, and they married 3 months later on December 7th. He'd been transferred to Pan American's West Coast base and had to leave immediately, so if Mother hadn't said yes, he'd be gone forever. They spent their honeymoon driving across the country in his classy 1935 Ford V8 four-door touring sedan to his new assignment in Alameda, California. So Mother, too, was a pioneer. She'd never been north of North Carolina nor west of Tallahassee, yet she married a man she scarcely knew and left for a brand new life in places unknown to her. Once there, she saw her new husband take off on dangerous missions across the uncharted ocean for weeks at a time, not knowing when or if he'd return. He crewed on Martin 130 flying boats as they surveyed the Pacific. Their mission, to develop the routes that Pan American's China clippers would eventually take. Daddy was interviewed about those missions in 1980, the year before he died. He was the junior officer, low member in the crew. The airplane was completely stripped down. No floors, no heat, no seats, no cargo, no passengers. Just crew with our fur-lined flying suits and boots and gloves, and the only heat in the airplane was up in the cockpit at the pilot's feet. We were taking a lot of fuel and an airplane and a crew to find out if we could find those islands in the Pacific. Trial and error. He told of a time his plane was delayed in Guam with an engine change. I had only been married a few months. Because I was delayed, I got the ham radio operator to wire my new bride. Go to the company, get the Pan American paycheck. They will arrange for you to cash it and use the money. She sent a message back. Already received check. Check cashed. Money gone. One of my favorite stories is one he told about the time when he was navigator on a trans-Pacific flight. There were few landmarks. Pilots found their way just as sea captains did, by celestial navigation. So clouds and wind affected estimated times of arrival. One landmark was Pinnacle Peak, a tall point in the middle of the Pacific Ocean covered with white guano, making it easy to see during the day. By Daddy's calculations, he knew they were due to fly over Pinnacle Peak at a certain hour. That hour came and went, and no Pinnacle Peak. He figured his calculations were wrong, so he took a time out to go to the head. In those days, the open toilet gave a clear view of the wide world below. And as Daddy prepared to use it, there below him, framed by the hole, was Pinnacle Peak, right where it should be. Pan American inaugurated its trans-Pacific passenger service in October 1936. Daddy crewed on those flights till he was transferred back to Miami in 1937. Mother's transcontinental flight to join him took 2 days, and she was 8+ months pregnant with me. Just weeks later, on September 13th, I made my debut. The same day, Daddy earned the designation Master of Ocean Flying, the highest commercial pilot rating at the time. The news that he'd fathered a baby girl, his firstborn, came over the radio while he executed the flight tests, water takeoffs, and landings. He was transferred to Trinidad when I was 6 weeks old, back to Miami in 1939, and then to New York in 1941, in time for the arrival of my baby brother, Howard. Daddy commanded Boeing 314 Clippers. Do that and lose my place. With a range of 3,500 miles, they were the largest commercial planes until jumbo jets came along in the 1970s. He flew across the Atlantic to Southampton, England, via Gander, Newfoundland. Later, during World War II, in addition to the northern route, he flew to Lisbon by way of the Azores and to Africa. Now you see why they're called seaplanes, flying boats. With a range, let's see. The Boeing 314 flying boat was transportation fit for royalty, world leaders, movie stars, and, as it turned out, fit for an American president. They were the most luxurious airplanes in the world at the time. Books were written and movies made about them. White-coated stewards pampered the passengers, relaxing in the 7 plush lounges. Chefs prepared meals served on china, silver, and crystal. At night, couches converted to curtained berths. At least one writer dubbed it the Airborne Palace. My family lived in Douglaston, Queens, on Long Island's North Shore. We had a black 1939 Ford that Mother used to ferry Daddy to and from LaGuardia Airport's Marine Air Terminal, the MAT. During the war, clipper takeoffs and landings occurred after dark. My parents had a boxy wooden 1937 RCA 810T super heterodyne radio next to their bed. Howard still has that radio in his attic, but he says I can buy one on eBay for $150. The radio was set to the shortwave frequency used by Pan American's flying boats. Mother knew approximately when Daddy was due to arrive, usually in the middle of the night, and had the radio tuned to the station. She'd hear his deep captain's voice give the tower his clipper flight number and then say, "On the water." At that, she knew to bundle the sleeping children into the Ford's back seat and head to the mat. During the war's blackout, the yellow sodium vapor lights along Cross Island Parkway were darkened, and the top half of cars' headlamps were covered with black tape. I can only imagine what those midnight rides must have been like for Mother with her precious cargo. But Howard and I usually slept through the round trip and awoke the next morning in our own beds with our daddy at home right where he belonged. When the United States entered World War II, just months after Daddy started the Atlantic run, Pan American World Airways devoted its people and planes to the effort. The airline painted clippers a camouflage gray, their keels ocean blue, and pilots wore military uniforms when they flew wartime missions for the Army and Navy. Pan American crews searched, sighted, and reported on German ships and U-boats prowling the Atlantic. Daddy was a lieutenant in the Naval Reserve, and photographs taken of him on the Casablanca trip show him wearing his Navy service dress khaki uniform. In January 1943, President Roosevelt was to meet with Allied leaders for a conference in Casablanca, French Morocco, and North Africa. Considering the secrecy of President Roosevelt's mission and the dangers of wartime travel, those in charge of security could not risk his going by ship. Although a sitting president had never before flown outside the United States, they decided air travel was the only viable answer. As it was, a direct flight from the U.S. to Casablanca was out of the question. Given all the requirements for safety, security, and comfort, the Navy chartered Pan American's Boeing 314 flying boats for the transatlantic trip. The Dixie Clipper, which inaugurated the first regularly scheduled service across the Atlantic in June 1939, was chosen as the president's plane, with my father as captain. The Atlantic Clipper, captained by his friend Richard W. Vinell, would carry the rest of the large party. It also served as backup in case anything happened to the president's plane. Since then, two planes have always been on all Air Force One flights. Only the best and most experienced pilots were assigned to the Boeing 314s, and I always believed Daddy was chosen to captain the president's plane because he was the best of the best. However, the New York Times February 2, 1943 edition reported neither pilots nor crew were specially selected, receiving the assignments under routine. The Clippers were in New York. President Roosevelt was to take the train from Washington, D.C., and then leave on his historic trip from Pan American's headquarters on Dinner Key in Miami. The only thing the captains were told was to ferry two planes from New York to Miami, where they would pick up a passenger named Mr. Jones and his party. Destination? Unknown. They were told they'd be gone for several weeks, so Pan American arranged for Mother, Howard, and me to deadhead, that's airline talk for fly for free, on the Dixie Clipper to Miami, where we stayed with friends till his return. The president's train arrived from Washington early on January 11, 1943. Only after their passenger was on board did the crew learn Mr. Jones was actually Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States of America, on his way to the Casablanca Conference. Before World War II, Clippers flew the North Atlantic in less than 24 hours. This trip was to be different. The two Clippers left Miami and flew to Port Spain, Trinidad, 10 hours away, where they spent the night. The next day, they flew 8 hours south along South America's east coast and across the equator to Belém, Brazil. After overnighting there, they left on January 13th for Africa's west coast. Because of stiff headwinds as they headed eastward across the South Atlantic, that leg of the trip, 2,500 miles, took 15 hours. The Clippers and their crews waited 2 weeks at Bathurst, British Gambia on Africa's west coast, while TWA planes flew President Roosevelt overland to Casablanca in Morocco. At some point during the transoceanic flights, the president and the other passengers signed dollar bills traditionally known as short snorters for the crew. The Casablanca Conference was history-making in itself. During the 10-day conference, President Roosevelt met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and French Generals Charles de Gaulle and Henri Giraud to plan the Allies' European strategy. The most important agreement to come from the meetings was that the Allies would take nothing less than unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. President Roosevelt returned to Bathurst on January 25 and left for the United States on the Dixie Clipper on January 27. The westbound route was the same as the eastbound, but there was a change of planes. The Atlantic Clipper could no longer provide escort because of trouble in one engine, so the president flew from Brazil to Trinidad on a TWA plane. The Dixie Clipper and a replacement escort clipper met up with him in Port of Spain and flew on to Miami, where they landed on January 30th, 1943, the president's 61st birthday. On the way to Africa, knowing they would be in the air on that significant date, Daddy made arrangements for the Pan American stewards to pick up a cake in Trinidad on the return flight. This famous photograph shows President Roosevelt with Fleet Admiral W.D. Leahy to his right, advisor Harry Hopkins directly across from him, and the Dixie Clipper's captain, Howard M. Cone Jr., on the far right. The large rectangular windows were typical of Boeing 314 Clippers. According to one account, the support staff laid on a feast complete with caviar, olives, celery, pickles, turkey and dressing, green peas, cake, and champagne, all served on a table laid with white linen. The New York Times reported that Captain Cone drank coffee. The president cut the cake and handed out big slices to all the staff and crew. The president deplaned in Miami after flying more than 1,500 miles, strenuous for the frail 61-year-old FDR, suffering from polio since 1921. He returned to Washington by train. The next day, Mother, Howard, and I flew back to New York with Daddy on the Dixie Clipper. We flew into New York on February 1st, 1943, arriving at LaGuardia Airport's Marine Air Terminal. I well remember that magnificent circular Art Deco building, especially the heroic figures in the colorful WPA mural that wrapped around its inside walls. The colossal couple waving to a departing clipper, the men in Pan American uniforms plotting routes, or maybe they were looking at weather reports, with the huge globe of the world anchoring the center of the room. The MAT is still at LaGuardia, complete with the original murals and a photo exhibit of Pan American's golden years. By the time we returned to New York, President Roosevelt had announced the news of his trip to the Casablanca conference. Up until then, it had been a deep, deep secret. In those days, reporters were on hand for every Clipper arrival. New York Times archives have all the articles announcing landings of Clippers at the MAT, along with the names of passengers and pilots. Captain Howard M. Cone Jr. is mentioned in many. On one flight, his passenger of note was Queen Wilhelmina of Holland. As thanks for getting her safely to her destination, she gave him a sterling silver cigarette case with a royal crest on it. He didn't smoke, but we still have that cigarette case. The day we arrived in New York, the press corps was in wait. Looking back, it must have been like modern-day paparazzi mobbing celebrities. After all, my own father was a celebrity, held in the same kind of esteem as today's astronauts. Reporters pushed and shoved each other and yelled at us. I remember how their flashbulbs blinded us. My family has a newspaper clipping with a photograph taken that day. The four of us are standing in the terminal's main room. Like all travelers of the time, we're dressed in our finest. Daddy, so tall and strong in his uniform, holds me. I'm wearing my best winter hat, coat, leggings, and Mary Janes, clinging to his neck as though trying to escape the chaos. Mother, holding baby Howard in his snowsuit, is dressed like a proper lady of the 1940s, with her perky hat's feather tilted forward at an angle. It's Howard, 20 months old, who personifies the madness of the scene. His eyes enormous, his eyebrows drawn tight, his lips pursed, too frightened to cry. After the trip, the War Department held a press conference with the captains of the Pan American and TWA planes that carried President Roosevelt. The papers reported that Captain Cone said the president was an excellent passenger and a good air sailor on his 15,000-mile round trip, displaying an impressive knowledge of geography. I don't remember that flight, but I do remember a trip on a Clipper flying boat when I was 8 years old. I thought the luxurious planes were nice and comfy. Didn't everyone fly like this? And my daddy was the man up top, so everything was okay. I have a precise mental image of the narrow metal spiral stairway that ran from the lower deck to the cockpit. And yes, family members were allowed in the cockpit in those days. And how salt spray covered the windows in the passenger compartment as we took off and landed on the water. And I remember how wonderful it was to see the clouds from above. As my little brother said, I thought those clouds weren't attached to the sky. How much I loved those planes. They're still in my heart. Only 12 were produced. Sadly, none remains, though a full-size replica is on display at the Foynes Flying Boat and Maritime Museum in Limerick, Ireland. Later in his career, as new airplanes phased in, Daddy trained for and captained several different prop planes, including Boeing B-77 Stratocruisers and Lockheed Constellations, Connies to us, before moving on to Boeing 707 jets, from boats to jets. During those years, he flew to almost every part of the world, the great capitals of Europe and South America, Tokyo, Bangkok, Johannesburg, and Howard and I were the lucky kids who got to vacation in some of those exotic destinations. Ever the adventurer, Daddy embraced change. He was an innovator, inventing all sorts of devices from the mundane, an easier way to start a gas-powered lawnmower, to the aeronautic, an analog device that calculated an aircraft's optimum altitude as it made its landing descent. My brother tells a story from 1962 that illustrates how eagerly our father anticipated and applied advances in aviation. Howard was a passenger en route to London's Heathrow Airport when Daddy was in command of one of the newest B-707 jets. Daddy conspired with the cabin crew to get Howard up to the flight deck as the plane made its final approach to London. He was thrilled to witness our father on the job at the helm of the latest in aviation technology. The view from the cockpit was dramatically different from what passengers saw from their windows. Howard said the plane flew through one great wall of cloud after another, as British accented voices directed air traffic over the radio. The airspeed indicator read 550 knots. Behind us, Howard recalled, all 120 passengers and crew trusted their lives to Father. The plane banked tightly into its final turn. Then, in Howard's words, just when it seemed the tension couldn't be any greater, the great captain turned, hands back on the controls, and with delight and pride said, "Isn't this autopilot the goddamnedest thing?" Daddy retired in 1968 at age 60, the mandatory retirement age for airline pilots at that time. Over his career, he carried many famous passengers, but the entire Casablanca experience is the most deeply embedded in our family's lore. At PS 98 reunions, I'm known as Captain Cone's daughter, not Carolyn. A friend, an antique dealer, an antique airplane buff, had a scale model of the Dixie Clipper made for me, complete with its wartime camouflage paint. It stands on a shelf in my living room beside Daddy's official Pan American black and white photograph, taken about the same time as the Casablanca trip. We have his handwritten log, clippings and photographs, souvenirs and books, even the plane's menus autographed by movie stars. Unfortunately, his short snorter with the signatures of everyone on the Dixie Clipper, including those of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Howard M. Cone Jr., was a victim of the March 1993 no-name storm that swept a tidal surge through Mother's house in Crystal River, Florida. The signatures are blurred and almost indecipherable, but we keep it anyway. This framed print hung in our house when I was a girl. Pan American Airways clippers were named after the great sailing ships of the 19th century. Except for the model clipper, my brother and I packed everything else in boxes, moved them from place to place, and it all is still in those boxes. I know more now about what we call the Roosevelt flight than ever before. I've come to understand that even though it lives in my heart, it is forgotten history to most everyone else. Recently, I told a man in his 40s about this episode in my family's past. He knew a little bit about President Roosevelt and thought maybe he'd heard about Pan Am, not our Pan American World Airways, of course, but nothing about the romance of the Clipper flying boats or the significance of the Casablanca Conference. The only reason my grandsons, now in their 30s, know or care about it is that they've seen the pictures of their great-grandfather, his souvenirs, and our model plane. To almost everyone else, it's gone, past and forgotten, 8 decades ago. Moon landings, which began in 1969, are history to them. In 2013, my grandson sent me a live video feed of an astronaut singing Space Oddity from the International Space Station. We'll keep moving the boxes as long as I last, but when does history become junk? Maybe we'll donate the souvenirs to the Pan Am Historical Foundation or the Air and Space Museum in DC, but bits and pieces of it are mine, in my head, in my heart. I was 5 years old and I was there. 3 cheers for Captain Cone. Hip, hip, hooray, hip, hip, hooray. Hip, hip, hooray for Daddy, the Argonaut.